We're about ready to get started. There we go. Hopefully everyone has a book by now. If you want a PDF, I've already had people reach out for a PDF copy or a digital copy. If you're interested in that, let me know, and that will be made available to you if it hasn't already been. I'm so excited to be teaching this class. When the elders gave me the opportunity to put a book together, and I found out it was going to be about the Exodus, I was really excited. I had actually, my sermon I preached a few months ago on Joseph, I was writing that sermon as I was kind of writing the introduction for this book, and you will notice that Joseph was a big player in the introduction, so it all kind of came together really nicely. Just kind of by way of introduction, before we get started, you'll notice a few things about the book. Number one, there's the table of contents, which is self-explanatory. On the bottom of the table of contents, you'll see appendix number 1 is fast facts. As we go through all of these lessons, I hope that we're going to be covering a lot of territory in a relatively short amount of time. And with that, I'm going to try and kind of avoid some of the more trivial kind of questions, just mere fact questions. What? Oh yeah, if anybody needs a book, Taylor has them. So thank you. But we're going to be like I said, we're going to be covering a lot of Bible and a lot of history in a relatively short amount of time. So the fast facts are going to be in each lesson and in the back, just to kind of knock out some of those some of that basic information that we're going to see throughout the text. That's not exhaustive. There are going to be things that either aren't in there or we could include later. But there's that, and then a couple things about the lessons themselves. Number one, there's the text. You'll notice that there's the text covered, and then the suggested reading, and then each question has kind of a citation. So the text covered, if you're feeling really ambitious, some of these readings are going to be really long, and some of them are going to be not as long. But if you want to read the text covered, you can. If you just want to do the suggested reading and then go and answer the questions from there, you can. Or if you just want to look over the fast facts, start at question number 1, and just go about it that way. You can do whatever you want. But that's just to kind of explain what the text covered is, the suggested reading, and then obviously you'll see the citations as we go throughout the questions. I would, if you haven't read the introduction already, it's called How Did We Get Here? If we're talking about getting out of Egypt, we want to know how we got into Egypt, and who's in Egypt, and why are we leaving. So that kind of, the introduction is kind of answering some of those questions. And those are kind of the basics. Let's go ahead and say a prayer, and then we'll get started. Father, we're so grateful to you for this time that we have to study your word together. We're thankful for Moses and his life that you've recorded for us. We're thankful for your power that we're going to see throughout the Exodus story. We're thankful for all of this history and all of these stories that we have to teach us about you and teach us what faith looks like and what power looks like, and help us to, throughout this study, learn more about your character and who you are and how we can better serve you. Thank you for this class. Thank you for this opportunity, and help us to learn everything we can through the text that we're going to be covering. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. Okay, so you'll notice with lesson number 1, we're going to be talking about the call of Moses. If you read the introduction, you'll notice at the end, this isn't a class on the book of Exodus. We're going to be talking about the time period of the Exodus, but really the Exodus itself, what I would call the event of the Exodus, is really only going to take up this class and the next class. I just realized I don't have the clicker. Is it up here? I think so. It should be. I'm going to need that, so that's my bad. But sorry about that. There we go. Okay. My apologies. So this lesson number 1 is going to be the call of Moses, and so we're going to be covering the first 7 chapters of Exodus. You'll notice we kind of have an overview here In Exodus chapter 1, Israel populates Egypt. Slavery worsens. We know that the Israelites got into Egypt via, Israel, of course, right? Their namesake, but specifically through Joseph, his son. And like I said, we had a sermon about that relatively recently, but you also read about that in the introduction. But really, this is kind of the text, what we see the text covering in those first 7 chapters. This story, this book, rather, like I said, it's not going to just be, we're starting in chapter 1 of Exodus and we're going straight through the book of Exodus. In many ways, this class is going to be on the life of Moses. We're starting with the call of Moses. We read about the birth of Moses in Exodus chapters 1 and 2. We read about his early life just a little bit. But we're going to end with his death, not to spoil the class, but Moses is going to die in chapter 13. So in many ways, this class is going to be a class covering the life of Moses. And for tonight's class, I want to kind of view what we're talking about as getting to know the characters, if you will. I know this obviously isn't a novel. This is the inspired word of God. These are not just characters. These are historical people. These are real people. But in many ways, as we look at Exodus, the first 7 chapters of Exodus, we're getting to know Moses and we're getting to know God. We're getting to know Aaron a little bit, some of these different people that we're going to see throughout the book of Exodus and throughout these years of the Exodus itself, and then obviously the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. But as we go throughout this class, you'll notice a lot of these questions. Some of these questions are maybe easier than others. Some of these questions are maybe more straightforward than others. But then at the end, we have some discussion questions. So we'll spend more time on the discussion questions, but really, as we go through, this isn't going to be a verse-by-verse study, but these questions really are going to kind of be the talking points that we're going to be talking about as we go through this text. So I know that was kind of a lot of housekeeping and introductory material, but before we get into the text itself and the questions, does anybody have any questions or comments about what this is or what to expect? Okay. So, like I said, we start in Exodus chapter 1. One thing I wanted to notice to talk about at the beginning was how long was Israel in Egypt. There's different verses that say different things. I just kind of wanted to cut this off at the pass. Ben, in helping me prepare for this class, loaned me a book. It's two books called Alleged Bible Contradictions. I believe he has preached a sermon or two here and other places about some of those contradictions. This is one of those. Some places say 430, some places say 400. His last name is Lyons. I forget his first name, but he breaks down these numbers really in a way that's really, really helpful. But as we're talking about how long Israel was in Egypt, just how much history we're talking about here as they prepare to leave, the first number that we see here on the screen is 430. That would be the way this man Lyons, by the last name Lyons, the way he explains it is 430 years would be the time from the promise being made to Abraham until the Exodus. And by the Exodus, I mean the event of the Exodus, right? One of the citations he gives there is Exodus 12, 40, and 41. If we're thinking about 400 years, that would be from Isaac, so obviously that would start later. The way he said it was, this would be from when Isaac was weaned, so when Isaac was born. By the time Isaac came along until and chosen as the heir rather than Ishmael, until the time of the Exodus itself. And then there's kind of these two periods of 215 that adds to 430 from Abraham's call to Jacob entering Egypt to see Joseph, and then the next 215 of that 430 would be from Israel's family entering to the Exodus. I am happy to teach a Bible class. I am not a math teacher. So this is the only detail I'm going to be going into as far as this is concerned. If you're curious to see that broken down a little bit more detail, I scanned the article and I have a PDF of it. So if you want to send me an email or send me a text, I would be happy to share that with you. And if you want to borrow the physical book, it's Ben's, so you can ask him. But that's just kind of some of those things that we're going to be to put all of this into perspective as far as how long the nation of Israel has been in Egypt and what they're doing there. But if we're going to go ahead and get into the text, in Exodus chapter 1 and in the introduction, we saw that Israel is increasing greatly in Egypt, and what we kind of see is the more that Israel increases. Obviously, God tells Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. And God is not going to be stopped in that. But what Pharaoh tries to do, as many dictators throughout history have done, is they try and kind of squash the resistance before the resistance is there, right? So these people are enslaved in Egypt, they're populating Egypt, and so the more they populate Egypt, the more enraged, really, and the more jealous and the more tyrannical, really, Pharaoh's going to be about these people that are inhabiting the land. And so that kind of takes us through Exodus chapter 1. Pharaoh is even more severely oppressing these people. But then we get the birth of Moses. He's raised in Pharaoh's household, but then he's also kind of raised by his mother, right? But then he flees to Midian. And like I said at the beginning just a few moments ago, a lot of this is going to be kind of getting to know Moses in general. If we're studying the life of Moses, we're going to want to kind of take all the information we can get at the beginning as far as who he is and what he's like. So let's go ahead and read Exodus 2:11 through 15, and then we'll get some comments about what we learn about Moses' character. Exodus 2 and verse 11 says, "One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man in the wrong, 'Why do you strike your companion?' And he answered, 'Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?' And then Moses was afraid and thought, 'Surely the thing is known.' When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well." So right off the bat, we're learning some things about Moses and his character and who he is. How did we answer this question? What do we learn about Moses' character? Yeah, JD, and then Ben.
I said that from these verses alone, I saw Moses as a man who fought against injustice, who had quite a bit of self-preservation, and was also, at least at this point and other points later in his journey, ruled by impulse, or at the very least he was impulsive.
Okay, right, good. So he has a strong sense of justice. I think maybe we all have a friend like that. Maybe we see that in ourselves, that friend who, if something's wrong, they're going to be the one to say something about it. And sometimes maybe that kind of gets them in trouble a little bit. But just that strong moral compass, that strong sense of justice, but then the minute he's being called out for it, or the minute people are seeing it and he doesn't want people to see it, he doesn't like that. Ben?
Yeah, we talked about this with him being loyal to the Hebrews, but also being rash. It made me think about Genesis 9 about shedding man's blood as well. So we saw some of those qualities with him.
Right. Yeah, he's a little bit impulsive, like has been said, a little bit rash. Tanya, and then Stephen.
I would say a little bit of a temper, possibly, and a little bit of self-righteousness mixed with that temper.
For sure. We have self-preservation, we have self-righteousness, definitely a temper, obviously. Stephen?
Yeah, we have a little bit of insight into his mindset in Acts, right? Acts chapter 7. Right? It says in verse 25, "For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand." I think you can talk about this incident. So for me, he had a lot of faith in the people that might have been misplaced. He believed that they were also looking for deliverance and willing to do what it took to get it in his own mind. He didn't really understand, I think, fully what God's intentions were to deliver them the way he wanted to.
Right, exactly. When we see that sense of justice, again, there's my sense of justice, and then there's God's sense of justice, right? Sometimes we can, and sometimes I would hope, as Christians, as God-fearing people, those two senses of justice are aligned, but that doesn't mean I get to take matters into my own hands. And even if God has told me I'm going to deliver these people, that doesn't mean, and even once he has told Moses, you are going to deliver these people, that doesn't mean Moses gets to go rogue and do it himself and do it his own way. That's not what this means. So just a few things that these have really already been mentioned. A strong sense of justice, strong Hebrew identity, going back to what Ben was saying, despite his upbringing. He's timid in the face of judgment. Again, I think we all probably have a friend, or again, maybe see it in ourselves, where they really want to be the one to start a fight, but then as soon as they get called out about it, or the minute they get caught, or something like that, maybe they don't want to back up what they were saying. So he's kind of timid in the face of judgment, but again, he, like has been said, he can be short-sighted, he can be hot-tempered, and we're going to see these things. I know we all know what happens, but I also don't want to spoil it, I guess. But we're going to see him be more hot-tempered and more short-sighted later in his life. But moving on to the second question, what does the state of the burning bush show us about God? If we think about, again, getting to know these characters, getting to know these people, again, God is God. He is in a realm of his own. He is a being of his own. There's no one like him. But when we see the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3 and starting in verse 2, look at how the burning bush is and what's happening with the burning bush, and just think to yourself, why would God do this? What is God demonstrating about himself in getting Moses' attention the way he does? In verse 2 of chapter 3, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. JD?
In my notes, the state of the burning bush, it simply demonstrates God's true, absolute command over that which he has created.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Really the main thing, my main, I guess, purpose in asking this question and why I wanted to draw attention to it is you really see God's sovereignty over his creation, right? When a lot of times when we talk about miracles, right? One of the biggest factors that we see in biblical miracles is that they are clear, they're obvious, right? Sovereign over creation. But when here I have miracles are obviously nonsensical or impossible. I don't mean miracles are nonsense. That's not what I mean by the word nonsensical. But what I mean by that is, if you've ever seen a brush fire, right, or if you've ever thrown leaves into a fire or thrown greenery into a fire, it burns. Fire burns things. The only being who can light something on fire and make it not burn is God, right? And so that same with other miracles we see, like the feeding of the 5,000. The amount of food that they had and the number of people that they had don't go together. But God made it work because he's God, right? And that's what we see with these miracles. They're things that are impossible that God is making possible. Joanna?
Ben likes to say fire is always an imagery of judgment coming, and he's going to bring judgment on the nation of Egypt through Moses.
Mm-hmm. Exactly right. So That's another thing we see. Our God is a consuming fire. That's language taken from Hebrews chapter 12. If you look at discussion question number 2, the last discussion question in pretty much every lesson is going to be, what New Testament parallels do you see? So that's kind of something to think about as we go through this study together, and that's always where we're going to end. But like Joanna was saying, that language of our God is a consuming fire, this image of fire eats up everything in its path. Fire is just destructive. And that's not just to say that God is simply destructive, but certainly he has the power to take over whatever situation he's in. And we're going to see that might and that power and that intensity as we go throughout the Exodus story. Troy?
Well, this is sort of the first instance, other than Genesis chapter 3, of fire being used to indicate the presence of God. And Moses is going to see this again. The pillar of fire in chapter 13, Mount Sinai in chapter 19, and then in the tabernacle in chapter 40. So this is just a foreshadowing to show the presence of God.
Exactly. Fire becomes a major symbol, and again, it's not just symbolic, but it is representative of God's presence among his people. All those examples that you mentioned we're going to see throughout this study. And but again, going back to the language of Hebrews chapter 12, our God is a consuming fire. And obviously the Hebrew writer is using that in a more figurative sense, but calling on the properties that we just know fire has and what fire is and how it works, right? Question number 3, what does it mean to be standing on holy ground? This is taken from the same text, but if we're going to kind of translate this conversation of fire and the burning bush and what we learn about God, he says, you're on holy ground. Now, as people who go to church, we have our own definitions of what holy is, right? We could likely define the word holy, but if you were to take your definition specifically from what you see here between Moses and God, how would you define the word holy?
Holy would be in the presence of God. So wherever God is that is a holy.
Exactly, right. It's really just the presence of God, right? God is holy, God is holiness, and there is nowhere that is more holy, and really than the presence of God, and really nowhere is holy without God, right? Things that are holy because God has made them holy because he is holy. I'm trying to see how many times I can use the word holy in a sentence, but holy ground is where God is, right? So where God is holy. That's the exact definition I was going to say. So, but it's also hallowed, it's scary, and it's intense. It is a fearful thing to be in the presence of God. That would be terrifying. We don't know how big of a fire this was. We don't know how big of a bush this was. But still, even seeing something like that and then hearing this voice and being told to take your shoes off. But again, we're going to see as we go throughout this story and as we read in the book of Exodus that God demands respect. Because he is God, because of his nature, because of his character, he demands respect and he deserves respect and he will be respected. And that level of intensity and reverence is something that we're going to see time and time again, especially later. If you look at the table of contents, one of our lessons is worship in the wilderness. We're going to talk about some of the items of worship. We're going to talk about the tabernacle, and especially once we get into that conversation, we're going to hear more about holiness, and holiness is going to be a huge part of that. Stephen?
It's interesting that the part that plays in this location, Horeb, the mountain of God, is Mount Sinai. I mean, so it's just, he's going to visit this again, and he will do a lot there with God in delivering the law.
Exactly right. Yes, that is something to note, that Horeb and Sinai are the same place. So this mountain that Moses just happens to be on this day is a mountain that is going to have a major, major impact. It's going to be a major landmark, if you will, in the story of the Exodus. And once they leave, this is where they're going to come and get the law, which again, the law is going to have a lot to say about holiness. Holiness is going to be a major part of the law, a major reason behind the law, and this location is going to show up again. Hugh?
The miracle defies natural law. God created the natural laws. I can't imagine the feeling Moses had when he sees this bush aflame, but it's not being consumed. So like a gas fire alarm. It's not going anywhere. And that has got to be an humbling, a frightening, an awesome, a reverential experience to show the majesty of God. He's definitely in a special place.
Right. And you see, and it's interesting, he's so just, it's almost unexpected. If you didn't know what was about to happen with the burning bush, you were kind of following along with Moses, and you're like, what is this strange fire I'm seeing? And then as he kind of further inspects it further, then he sees that the bush isn't being consumed. And the minute you realize that, imagine if you were walking on a mountaintop somewhere or walking in the woods somewhere and you saw a fire, you might be scared, or you might want to go check it out, or whatever your reaction might be. But then when you see that there is a fire, but apparently there's no danger because nothing's being burned, then the awe and the fear and all of those things would certainly come into play. And it sets a precedent, like we've said, for God's presence and God's holiness throughout the Exodus story. Now, excuse me, we're going to get into some of Moses' excuses. When we look at Moses, I keep wanting to say Moses chapter 4, Exodus chapter 4, when we look at this and we look at Moses' excuses in Exodus chapter 4 and the things that he's saying to God, without reading them or having read them, what are they? What excuses does he give in this exchange with God?
We start in chapter 3, where he says, essentially, I'm no one special. What should I say in chapter 3?
Right. So I'm no one special. He doesn't know what to say. Yes, they do start in chapter 3. Thank you for that. And what else? Sorry, what? Right, he's not a good orator. He's just, I'm not very eloquent. When we think of people we want to be in charge, politicians or whatever have you, we usually think of them as eloquent speakers. They might not necessarily be, but that's usually something we associate with power. Nikki? Right, no one's going to believe him, right? So it's almost, it is humility in a way, but just kind of the humility of, I'm nobody, I'm just a shepherd. Like, yes, I'm familiar with Pharaoh, I was raised by his daughter, so I'm familiar with Egypt, I know the situation, but you want me to be in charge? He just doesn't feel like he's cut out for the job. Stephen?
Another excuse he gives is, they don't even know who you are. So they're going to talk about you, but who am I supposed to tell them sent me? Mm-hmm. I'm not going to people who already know you.
Right. When we think of, when you're reading the Bible, you know who God is, and you're familiar with the God of the Bible. But then, and we're even going to see that when we get to when Moses finally starts interacting with Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, "Who is the Lord that I should worship him?" You're telling me you want to go worship him, and I need to listen to him? I don't know him. I don't care about him. I don't want to listen to him. And then the plagues are going to happen, and Pharaoh is going to know the Lord very well. But all of these kind of excuses based on Moses's view of himself. He says, I'm a nobody. I don't know what to say. They won't believe me. I don't talk like a leader. I don't want to. And so it's just, there's so many different things that he says. I think that last one is not my favorite in the sense that it's good, but I think maybe I didn't think about that too much before I started kind of studying this more, but it's just so interesting to me after all this conversation in chapter 3 and the beginning part of chapter 4, and then you get to verse 13, and he says, "Oh, my Lord, please send someone else." He just kind of gets to this point of desperation of anyone but me. I really just, I don't want this. I don't want this power. I don't want to talk to Pharaoh. From what I read about Pharaoh, I wouldn't want to talk to him either. I wouldn't want to confront him either. I'm not envious of Moses' job, but Yeah, Tanya, were you going to say something?
It's an example of how we see ourselves. That doesn't mean that's how God sees us. So we don't know what God has prepared for us that maybe we're not ready for, but he sees the bigger picture, and he can help work through those things. And so this was kind of an example of that for me. We all have laundry lists, right? And God's like, that's great. You're going to go anyway, and I'm going to help you get through it. So the power really resided more with God, not with Jesus.
Right. So he, has this attitude of this is who I am. And that's what, I flashed it up there for a second, but took it away and now it's back. So notice what we're saying here, and kind of this goes right along with what Tanya was just saying. God does not console Moses based on Moses' character. Moses' call, this whole chapter, what we're talking about here, these few chapters, is about God. So Moses' insecurities are an affront to God's character. He allows the hurdles to stay. And what I mean by that is God does not tell Moses, I'm going to make you a great speaker. He allows Aaron to do the talking, right? If Aaron's going to do a better job at the talking, then God allows for that to happen. But Moses is focused on himself, right? Again, humility is a good thing. We view humility as a good thing. We want to be humble. But Moses' humility, he's almost putting that on God, right? And saying, I don't trust that you can make me who you're saying you're going to make me, right? And so that's what I mean by an affront to God's character. It's not like Moses is being outright blasphemous, but he is saying, you're telling me I'm going to do this, and I just genuinely don't think I can. Lori?
Acts 7:22 said, and this verse happened before this event. It said Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds. So the Bible has already commented on his speaking ability. He had it, he just didn't think he did. He didn't recognize it.
Mm-hmm. Right. So yeah, he's maybe just doesn't want to. And again, I think a lot of it really just comes down to, oh my Lord, please send someone else. At the end of the day, he just doesn't want to. But again, he's not looking at, I'm qualified for this job, or it's almost like he's not even looking at his qualifications. He's just saying, this seems like too intimidating of a situation for me. And I kept thinking about, as I was thinking about this, and what Moses is saying here, it kind of makes me think of David and Goliath. And when David is about to take on Goliath, they try and give him all this armor and the sword and all these different things, and it's like, well, he's kind of scrawny. He's going up against Goliath. We don't think he's going to fare too well. And so maybe, like, if he has the best armor and he has the best sword and he has all these resources at his disposal, maybe that will make him fit to go up against Goliath. And really, at the end of the day, what's so powerful about the David and Goliath story, and what happens is David says, me by myself versus Goliath, I don't stand a chance. And I get that, but I'm not by myself. Me plus God against Goliath, Goliath doesn't stand a chance. And that's kind of the realization that Moses is going to eventually come to, right? And that's kind of the internal battle that Moses is having here. And what God's saying is, you by yourself versus Pharaoh and the Egyptians, no, that's not going to go well. But that's not what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to work for me, and me on your team versus the Egyptians, Pharaoh doesn't stand a chance. Tim.
I think kind of like Paul, I feel like he was the right person in the right time with the right education. He was Hebrew, but he also was Egyptian, so he knew, God knew exactly what he was doing when he chose Moses. He also knew that these were going to be objections for Moses, so he was like, it's not like God acquiesced and said, okay, fine, you can do this or this, you can have Aaron, that's fine. He allowed it, but he knew that was going to happen anyway, part of his plan. But I also think that it's fascinating that he talked about his humility, yet that was his downfall in the end that kept him from getting into the promised land. When he struck the rock and said, must we provide you God in him? So it was a lack of humility that got him to the promised land. Mm-hmm. So I think that's fascinating.
Ben?
There's 14, the anger of the Lord burned against him. So this wasn't just something kind of like joking around or kidding around. You know, the response of God is a pretty powerful response as well. To get, I think, his attention, you know, this is what you're going to do, and here's how it's going to work.
Right, and kind of going back to what we were saying a minute ago with the Lord's, the anger of the Lord being kindled against Moses in chapter 4, verse 14, what we're going to see over and over again is God demanding respect. And he kind of does that here, right, where he says, if I tell you to do something and I'm telling you that this is my plan, he's not really asking, it's not like he's asking Moses to fill out an application or like, I think you might enjoy this or something like that. He's saying, I have chosen this for you and it will work. And it will work for my purpose, but you just have to trust me. And that trust being required of Moses. Obviously, it's a tall order. I'm not saying it was an easy task. It clearly wasn't, but that's what God's calling Moses to do, right, Stephen?
And we talked about, he had tried it his way 40 years ago, and he's probably in his 80s. He's been meeting for 40 years now. So he may have just come to this point, he's gotten discouraged about, well, he obviously knew something before he attempted that deliverance on his own in some way. He knew that was part of the plan for him to deliver his people, and it hasn't happened for 80 years. You know, so also that he may have been kind of just, I can't justify his excuses, but you could see how he'd gotten in this mindset maybe about himself too.
Right, exactly. And, you know, and I know they lived longer back then, right? But he's 80 when all of this is starting. And so if I would imagine when he gets to be 80, like Stephen's saying, and you're being told over the next 40 years you're going to do all of these things and you're going to be this great leader, and I don't care if you're not an eloquent speaker. I don't need you to be an eloquent speaker. I just need you to trust me and I need you to work for me. That's what Moses is going to do. We're going to go ahead and skip over Exodus chapter 4, verses 24 through 26. This is kind of I'll just mention it briefly. This is kind of an interesting scenario. This is one of those passages that when I went back to it and read it, I thought, I didn't know that was in there. You know, I feel like I had never read that before. And so he's... in verse 24, I'll just go ahead and read it. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. It was then he said a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision. So again, it kind of comes up out of nowhere, and it's only a couple verses, but it is interesting to see that when we already have circumcision on the 8th day by this point. We already have laws concerning how the Israelites are supposed to go about things as a nation. And so for Moses to evidently have not followed this law the way he was supposed to, it says the Lord is seeking out Moses to kill him. Moses' life is on the line because of this thing that he has not done. And so then his wife has to take care of it. And so right from the beginning of Moses' life and Moses' story, you see God is setting a very high bar for what Moses is to do, the type of integrity that Moses is to have, and how serious God is going to take the law, and we're just going to see that over and over again. So that's why I wanted to, it's not a exciting passage to talk about, but it does, I think, drive home a point as far as what God expects from his leaders and what God's going to continue to expect as far as obedience to his law. Ben?
I was just going to mention that about leadership. If he's going to lead this whole nation out, it's got to start with his family too. In Joshua chapter 5, those who were born in the wilderness, they had not been circumcised. So Joshua's going to have to do this as well, you know, as they begin to take the land. And so it's interesting how you see some of these patterns throughout.
Right, yeah. So again, from the leadership, it starts with his family. Moses is going to have to take this seriously in his own family unit, and that is going to kind of go into how the nation right? Sometimes we look at leaders, and this happens in politics all the time. We look at how leaders act, and we think, well, we don't really have to take the law seriously because they don't, or whatever we might think about that. But God is making it very clear, no, I expect more of my leaders, and I expect the utmost integrity from Moses going forward. So there's more to be said about that. Question number 5 is a list of the ways that God describes himself to Moses in Exodus 3 and 4. We've talked about some of those things, and we only have a few minutes left. So if any of you want the PowerPoint, you can, again, if you ever want anything or want to talk about anything that is referenced in class, I will send it to you. Just send me a text or call me or email me or anything. But then we get to these signs. We'll talk about the signs next week because that leads nicely into the plagues. We're going to be talking about the plagues next week. We're going to go through pretty much the whole story of the Exodus, the event of the Exodus itself. And these signs that we see, the staff turning into the serpent, we are introduced to the Egyptian magicians. Say Egyptian magicians 10 times fast. But we have the leprosy and then the Nile turning to blood, which is obviously the first plague, and will lead us nicely into the plagues. Now, with the couple minutes we have left, we'll cover some of the other questions. Next week we'll play a little bit of catch up, but I want to spend a couple minutes talking about God. What does God mean when he says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart? Now, if you look at references, there are multiple references as far as when sometimes the word says, God will harden Pharaoh's heart, but sometimes the Bible will say that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. But if we're going to kind of think about this, we might not like to read God is going to harden Pharaoh's heart. That might kind of seem off-putting to us, or like it can be easy to misunderstand that. So how do we work with that? What does that mean? JD?
Point where it says God will harden it, or Pharaoh will harden his own heart. I think that one's just because, as humans, translators can't really go word for word, especially with a text as old as this. But for me to hazard a guess as to what God means by I will harden his heart, going with that translation path, it's basically what I interpret it as. It's basically this translator's way of interpreting what may have actually been that Pharaoh simply will not listen. God is letting Moses know ahead of time that Pharaoh's not going to listen to you, even with my signs, because as we all know from Genesis, God gave man free will. So that's how I interpret it, because if God really wanted to, he could easily have controlled Pharaoh like a puppet string for this, but basically...
Right. Yeah, God in his sovereignty, right, God is capable. If he wanted to, he could force us to do things, but that's not consistent with his character. Like JD said, we have free will. We can do whatever we want. But we're going to see that he says he's going to compel Pharaoh with a mighty hand. He's going to, he will exert his influence over Pharaoh, and Pharaoh is not going to stiff arm God, right? God is not going to force Pharaoh to do anything that he doesn't want to do, but God will show these signs and do these signs, and Pharaoh eventually will, God eventually will win. Darren?
I think that, us individuals, we all have what I would call hot buttons, that if someone comes up and says a certain thing to us, it'll make us react a certain way that we have to be careful of. I think the same thing, God knew what the words to say and what to do to make Pharaoh hit, those hot buttons, right? Pharaoh was arrogant, he was going to be defiant, so if God directly challenged that authority, he was going to, Pharaoh was going to do what he was going to do, right? So I think that's kind of...
Right.
When I think the hardening, I think God knew what was in his heart, knew what to say,
right.
How the challenge is take the actions into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about, there's a couple things. One, we have free will. We are in charge of how we react to things. I have up there, if I make someone mad, is it forced? If I do something that causes someone to be angry, I didn't force them to be upset, right? I'm not. So that's maybe one way to think about it, but I think you really see God's answer when he says, Pharaoh will not let you go. God knows Pharaoh. He knows that Pharaoh will not let them go unless compelled by a mighty hand. And so kind of like Darren was saying, God is going to do these things and show these signs, and he knows what it's going to take to get Pharaoh to bend to his will. And that kind of brings us to the last point. If you remember that this man is willing to kill children to keep his power. And so when you're dealing with a man like that, you're going to have to do incredible things. And in a sense, you're going to kind of have to speak his language, if you will, in order to get them to do something that they're not initially inclined to do, right? We can talk more about that next week. Sorry for going over, but we'll finish up that conversation and move forward with lesson 2 next week. Thank you.